The bear was dead before it hit the snow, and Elias Kane was already deciding whether to carry it the 6 miles home or leave it for the wolves. And then he heard her scream. The sound cut through the frozen Colorado pines like a knife through canvas, sharp and sudden and terrified, and Elias's dark eyes snapped toward the ridge to the east, without a single moment of hesitation. He was a man built for emergencies, the way other men were built for comfort, wide across the shoulders, thick in the chest, with arms that had hauled timber and wrestled elk and split enough firewood to warm the whole of Cutter's Creek through 3 consecutive winters. His jaw was squared and dusted with dark stubble, his chestnut hair curling just below his collar where it had grown out through the long months of solitude, and his hands, God, his hands were the hands of a man who worked, scarred at the knuckles, permanently roughened, utterly capable. He stood 6'3" in his elk-hide boots, and when he moved through the mountain wilderness, he moved like he belonged to it, like the pines had simply grown up around a man who had always been there. He looked at the bear. He looked toward the ridge. He could not leave a 100-pound black bear lying in an open meadow with no marker, no covering, no way to find it again before the scavengers did their work. 3 days of tracking had gone into that kill. 3 days of cold camping in temperatures that dropped to 15 below at night, of eating dried venison and hardtack by a fire no bigger than a man's hat, of moving so quietly through the mountain that even the ravens had not noticed him. He needed that bear. The fat alone would keep his lamps burning through March and half of April. The hide would make a coat he could sell in Cutter's Creek or trade for the things he could not grow or make himself. But the scream had not stopped. It had become something worse. It had become silence. Elias Kane knelt beside the bear, drove the blade of his skinning knife into the snow as a marker, grabbed the animal's hind legs and began hauling it toward the nearest stand of spruce. He worked fast, with the grim efficiency of a man who had done 100 hard things in a hurry. The bear weighed exactly what it looked like it weighed, somewhere north of 90 pounds, maybe closer to 100 with the cold stiffening it, and he lifted it across his shoulders in a single motion, the weight settling over him like a yoke, and he ran. He ran through the snow with a dead bear on his back, and the silence ringing in his ears, and his breath coming in great white clouds that dissolved instantly in the January air. And he did not slow down until he had covered the 1/4 mile to the spruce stand, where he hung the bear from the lowest heavy branch by its hind legs, using the rope he kept coiled at his belt, tied it off with the kind of knot that would hold until spring if he needed it to, wiped his hands on his trousers, and then he turned east and he ran again, this time without the bear and considerably faster. The ridge took him 8 minutes of hard climbing. The snow was knee-deep in places, and he powered through it without slowing, grabbing at exposed roots and rocky outcroppings to pull himself upward, his chest burning with the cold air he was taking in too fast. He came over the top of the ridge at a dead sprint and pulled up short when he saw what was below. A wagon had gone off the trail, not badly. It had not tumbled down the canyon on the south side of the ridge road, which would have been a catastrophe with no survivors. But the right rear wheel had dropped into a drainage ditch hidden under the snow, and the axle had cracked clean through under the sudden jolt, and the whole right side of the wagon had dropped hard into the ditch, dumping half the load sideways into the snow. One of the horses was down, struggling, tangled in its traces. The other stood trembling and wild-eyed, snorting white breath, its weight pulling awkwardly against the tilted wagon tongue. And in the snow, 10 feet from the wagon, a woman was picking herself up. She was not young in the way that meant inexperienced. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with dark auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and was plastered in wet strands across a face that was currently very pale and very angry and very determined all at once. She was wearing a heavy wool coat that had seen better days, a dark blue dress beneath it that was now soaked through at the hem and the knees from the snow, and she was on her feet before Elias had fully registered that she had been on the ground, turning toward the downed horse with her jaw set like iron. "Easy," she was saying to the horse, and her voice was low and steady even though he could see her hands shaking. "Easy now, I have you. Easy." Elias came down the ridge the way he came down most things, fast and direct and without ceremony. He hit the flat of the road and closed the distance to the wagon in 15 long strides, and the woman heard him coming and spun around with a look that said clearly she had been afraid it was something worse than a man. And then she saw him and recalculated, and her expression shifted from raw fear to a kind of guarded relief. "The horse is tangled," she said immediately, as if they had been in the middle of a conversation and he was simply late to it. "I cannot get him free without someone holding his head." "I see that," Elias said. His voice was deep, the kind of voice that had been shaped by years of talking to no one but mountains, unhurried and low. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, and then, more honestly, "My shoulder. But it is not broken, I do not think. The horse." "Go to his head," Elias said. "Keep him calm. Do not let him thrash." She went without argument, which he noted with approval. She moved with purpose, picking her way through the churned-up snow to the downed horse's head, and she put her hands on its neck and began to talk to it in a low, continuous murmur. And the horse, a big roan that looked like it had more spirit than sense, stopped thrashing almost immediately. Elias moved to the traces, assessed the tangle in 3 seconds, pulled his knife, and cut the leather where it needed cutting and untangled the rest where it could be saved, and in 2 minutes flat, he had the horse free of the dangerous wrapping. The roan lurched to its feet, and the woman held on and kept talking, and the horse shook itself and stood trembling but upright. Elias straightened and looked at the wagon. The cracked axle was not something he could fix on the side of a mountain road in January. The wagon was not going anywhere. "Where are you headed?" he asked. She was still stroking the roan's neck, not looking at him. "Cutter's Creek," she said. "I was told it was only 12 miles from the Hargrove cutoff. I took what I believed was the right fork." "You took the wrong fork," he said. He was not unkind about it, simply factual. "The right fork from Hargrove is the South Trail. This is the mountain trace. It's shorter in miles, but it takes twice as long even with a good wagon, and you've got no wagon now." She turned and looked at the broken axle and the whole terrible situation, and she did not cry, which impressed him considerably. Her jaw tightened, and her green eyes, he could see now that they were green, a dark forest green, striking against the pallor of her face, went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: frustration, calculation, resignation, resolve. "How far is Cutter's Creek from here?" she asked. 6 miles, straight down this trace, if it were summer and the trail were clear," he said. "But it is not summer, and there is 3 feet of snow on the lower pass. On foot in this cold it would take the rest of the day and into the dark, and you would not survive the night in those clothes." She looked down at her coat as though she had briefly forgotten about her clothes, and then she looked back up at him with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite stubbornness, but something in between that he would later recognize as the default expression of a woman who had spent a very long time solving her own problems without help. "What do you suggest?" she said. "My cabin is 2 miles north up the high trace," he said. "My horse is there. I can take you into Cutter's Creek on horseback tomorrow if the weather holds, or in 2 days if it doesn't." He paused, because he was a man who believed in plain speaking. "It is not much of a cabin, and I live alone in it. I understand if you would rather take your chances on the trace." She looked at him for a long moment. He stood there and let her look, because he understood that she needed to assess him and that this was a reasonable thing for a woman alone on a mountain to do. He was aware, as he always was, vaguely aware without particularly dwelling on it, that he was a large and somewhat intimidating figure, the kind of man who, in a dark alley, would make most sensible people cross to the other side. On a mountain road in January with a broken wagon, he supposed the calculus was different. "Your name," she said. "Elias Kane." "I have heard that name," she said slowly. "The trapper. They say you know these mountains better than anyone." "They may be right about that," he said, without particular vanity. It was simply a fact. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. She straightened her spine and pushed the wet hair back from her face with a gesture that managed to look entirely composed. "I would be grateful for the use of your cabin, Mr. Kane." "Then let us move quickly," he said. "The light goes fast up here." He took what he could carry from the wagon, her traveling trunk, which proved to be heavier than it looked, a blanket roll, a small crate of provisions, and distributed the load across the 2 horses' backs, tying things off with the methodical precision of a man who knew exactly what ropes could hold and at what angles. Clara Whitmore watched him work and did not offer unhelpful suggestions, which he appreciated. She checked the wagon one last time, retrieved a leather satchel from under the seat that she tucked over her shoulder with particular care, and then she looked at the horses. "Should we leave the horses tied here?" she asked. "No," he said. "Wolves would find them before morning. We take them." He led them north up the high trace, one in each hand, with Clara Whitmore walking beside him at a pace that kept up with his own without complaint, even though the snow was thigh-deep in the drifted sections and he had to break trail for her. The temperature was dropping as the sun fell toward the western peaks, and he could hear her breathing quicken in the cold. But she did not say she was tired, and she did not say she was cold, and she kept moving. It took 40 minutes to reach his cabin. He heard her breath catch when she saw it, and he understood why. It was not the kind of structure that inspired confidence. It had been built by him alone over the course of a single frantic autumn 6 years ago, when he had arrived in these mountains with nothing but a pack, a rifle, and a vague notion that solitude was preferable to the life he had been living in Kansas. It was solid and weather-tight and warm, because those were the properties that mattered up here. But it was rough-hewn and low and dark from the outside, with a sod roof blanketed in snow and a single window covered in oiled paper that let in a dim amber light. "It keeps out the cold," he said, which was the only recommendation he could honestly make. "That is all that matters tonight," she said, and she meant it, which he could tell by the way she was moving toward the door. He got a fire going in under 3 minutes, a skill learned through absolute necessity in his first mountain winter, when slowness had nearly killed him. The cabin filled with warmth, and he got the horses into the lean-to he had built against the cabin's east wall, and he checked his wood supply, and he started water heating over the fire, and he moved through all of these necessary tasks with the quiet efficiency of long habit, while Clara Whitmore stood near the fire and let the warmth reach her. When she stopped shivering, she began to look around. He watched her from the corner of his eye, taking in the shelf of books above his bunk, which always surprised people who expected a trapper to be illiterate. The skins stretched on the wall in various stages of preparation, the elk antler hooks near the door, the neat stacks of dried provisions, the single cast-iron pot and the 3 tin plates and the tools hanging in their places. A small mirror, metal, not glass, a rawhide chair, a table he had built himself with boards too rough to be truly flat. "You read," she said. "When the weather is bad," he said. "There's not much else to do." She crossed to the shelf and tilted her head to read the spines. He went back to the fire. "Dickens," she said. "Thoreau, Emerson, the Bible." A pause. "Shakespeare." "A man left me the Shakespeare when he died," Elias said. "A fur trapper up near Leadville. He had carried it for 40 years, and he said it had been good company." "Is it?" she asked. "Good company?" "Better than most," he said. She laughed. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her, and it was the first genuinely warm sound he had heard in what felt like a very long time, because solitude had that effect. It made ordinary human sounds feel outsized, disproportionately precious. He did not look at her when she laughed. He focused on the fire. She sat in the rawhide chair, and he sat on the trunk near the door, and they drank hot water with dried berries steeped in it, which was the closest thing he had to tea, and she told him why she was going to Cutter's Creek. Her father had died in September, she said. He had been a cattleman near Pueblo, not a rich one, but a steady one, and when he had gone, he had left her the small house in Pueblo and a debt to the bank that she could not pay. She had sold what she could and paid what she could, and the rest had gone to the bank along with the house, and she had spent the autumn making arrangements and the beginning of winter making decisions, and the decision she had landed on was to come to Cutter's Creek, where her father's younger sister, her Aunt Marjorie, had been living for 15 years with her husband, who ran the general store. "She wrote to me in October," Clara said. "She said there was a schoolteacher position. The woman who had been teaching left in September to marry a man in Denver, and the town has been without a teacher since." She looked into her cup. "I have some education. My father believed in it." She said it without bitterness, only a kind of straightforward sadness. He was the kind of man who thought his daughter deserved the same learning as a son. "He was right," Elias said. She looked at him quickly, as if she had not expected that, and he met her eyes briefly, and then looked back at the fire, because he was not a man who was comfortable being looked at with that particular kind of searching attention. "Do you know Cutter's Creek well?" she asked. "I go in 2-3 times a year for supplies," he said. "I know the people there well enough." "Is it a good place?" He considered it honestly. "It is a hard place," he said. "Most places in these mountains are, but the people are generally decent. There is a doctor, there is a church, though it shares a preacher with 2 other towns, and he only comes every 3rd Sunday. Your aunt and uncle's store is the center of most things. It is not Pueblo." He paused. "But Pueblo is not where you are going." "No," she agreed. "Cutter's Creek is where I am going." They ate beans that he had soaked since morning and cornbread he made in the cast-iron pot, and it was simple food, but it was hot and there was plenty of it, and she ate with the uncomplicated appetite of someone who had been cold and frightened and had not eaten since morning. He gave her his bunk and slept by the fire wrapped in elk hide, and he lay awake for a while listening to the wind come up outside and thinking that this was the most company he had experienced in longer than he cared to calculate. He had meant to stay awake until he was sure the weather was settled, but the fire and the warmth and the particular kind of tiredness that came from carrying a 100-pound bear and running a half-mile uphill on top of it pulled him down into sleep before he was ready, and he dreamed of nothing in particular and woke before dawn feeling more rested than he had in weeks. He got the fire going again and was starting cornmeal porridge when Clara Whitmore appeared from behind the blanket he had hung across the bunk for privacy, fully dressed and with her hair neatly pinned, looking as composed as if she woke every morning in a trapper's mountain cabin. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. "Weather held. We can go down to Cutter's Creek today." Something that might have been disappointment crossed her face, so quickly that he almost missed it. "Good," she said, and it sounded genuine but also careful. They ate breakfast and he saddled his horse, a big gray mountain horse named Luther, who had more sense than most people Elias knew. And then the question of the 2 other horses arose, and he solved it by leading them and letting Clara ride Luther, which she accepted without protest after one look at the snow on the lower pass. They made good time down the mountain, better than he had expected, and he broke trail when it was necessary. And she handled Luther with a quiet competence that told him she had grown up around horses. The town of Cutter's Creek appeared through the trees in the early afternoon, a collection of perhaps 40 buildings spread along a valley floor with the creek running through it, ice-fringed and dark in January. There was a main street with a boardwalk on one side, a livery, a church, a saloon, the general store whose sign he recognized from past visits, a modest hotel, and the clustered houses beyond, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys into the cold blue sky. Clara Whitmore sat up straighter when she saw it, and something in her face opened. "There it is," she said. "There it is," he agreed. He took her to the general store first because that was where her aunt was, and he held Luther's head while she slid down and stamped the cold from her feet. And then the door of the store opened, and a woman in her late 40s with the same dark auburn hair as Clara but piled higher and streaked through with gray came through it at a speed that suggested she had been watching the window. And Clara said, "Aunt Marjorie." And the 2 women held each other in the street with the January wind coming down from the mountains, and Elias stood with Luther and looked at the peaks and gave them their moment. He sold the horses at the livery. They were good horses, and the liveryman was honest and gave him fair prices, and he went back to the general store to retrieve the provisions he had carried down on the horses' backs. And the uncle, a short, broad man with a Welsh accent named Thomas Whitmore Evans, who had apparently taken his wife's family name into his own at marriage, shook Elias's hand with both of his and said he would not hear of Elias leaving without supper. Elias was going to decline. He had declined Thomas Evans's invitations before. The man was sociable to a degree that Elias found overwhelming. But Clara came out from the back room where she had been changing into dry clothes, and her aunt was behind her asking questions, and the store smelled of coffee and fresh bread, and the wind outside was picking up again. And Elias looked at all of this and said yes. Supper was at the table in the back of the store where the Evanses lived, in rooms that were small but warm and crammed with the comfortable chaos of a life that had accumulated things over 15 years in the same place. There was roast rabbit and boiled potatoes and bread and dried apple pie. And there was coffee, real coffee, and Elias drank 2 cups of it and felt it reach him in a way that the berry water from the night before had not. Thomas Evans asked him about his winter trapping, which was a subject Elias could discuss, and asked about the bear, and Elias told him about the bear and the 3 days of tracking and the shot that had finished it. And Thomas leaned forward with his elbows on the table and listened with the genuine interest of a man who had never hunted anything larger than a grouse and found the whole enterprise magnificent. Clara listened too, from across the table, with her chin in her hand and her dark green eyes moving between Thomas's animated face and Elias's quieter one. And when Elias mentioned that he had left the bear hanging in the spruce stand 6 miles up and intended to go back for it in the morning, she said, "You ran all that way carrying it, and then came and helped me, and then walked all the way back to the cabin, and then all the way down here in the snow. All in one day." "It needed doing," he said. "Most people would have left the bear," she said. "I meant helping you," he said, and then wished he had said it differently because it came out more personal than he had intended, and she looked at him with those green eyes and a small, unreadable smile. He went back up the mountain the next morning and retrieved the bear, working alone in the gray January light to skin it and section the meat and pack the fat and roll the hide, and he carried it all down on Luther's back and spent 2 days at his cabin processing everything. And he did not think about Clara Whitmore more than a man could be reasonably expected, not to think about a woman who had appeared in his mountains out of nowhere and laughed at Shakespeare and eaten his beans without complaint and sat across a supper table from him like she had always been there. He thought about her considerably. He went into Cutter's Creek 3 weeks later, which was sooner than he usually would have, because he needed salt and he needed powder and he needed new rope, which was all true, and had nothing to do with Clara Whitmore at all, except that it had everything to do with her. She was at the school. The schoolhouse was on the east end of the main street, a single-room frame building that had been thrown up in a hurry 5 years ago and showed it, with a stovepipe hat and a bell above the door, and the sounds of children's voices carrying through the cold air as he rode past. He did not stop. He went to the general store and got his salt and his powder and his rope, and he talked to Thomas Evans about the weather and the fur prices and the state of the mountain trails, and Thomas offered him coffee and he took it. Clara came in at 4:30, when the school day was done, with snow on her boots and ink on her fingers, and her hair escaping its pins in the way it seemed to do whenever she'd been busy. She stopped when she saw him, just for a half a second, and then she kept moving toward the back of the store and said, "Mr. Kane, are you staying in town tonight?" "No," he said. "I need to get back up before dark." She stopped and turned and looked at him with an expression that was thoughtful and direct. "Would you like to stay for supper?" she asked. "Aunt Marjorie made a pot roast." He told himself he was going to say no. He said yes. This became, without either of them precisely deciding it, a pattern. He came to town every 3 weeks or so through the rest of January and all of February, always with legitimate reasons: supplies, trading, taking hides to the buyer who came through on the second Friday of the month, and he always found himself at the Evanses' table by evening, and Clara was always across from him. They talked, the 4 of them together and separately, and gradually Elias found that the thing he had been avoiding by living alone on a mountain for 6 years, which was the particular vulnerability that came with knowing someone well enough to care about them, was happening to him without his permission. Clara Whitmore was smart, not in the careful, modest way that some people were smart, calibrating their intelligence to what they thought others could bear, but in a genuine and unself-conscious way that showed in the speed of her thinking and the precision of her language and the way she asked questions that cut straight to the center of things. She had opinions about books and about cattle prices, and about the best method of teaching children long division, and about whether the new territorial governor was likely to be any better than the last one, and she held these opinions firmly and defended them without aggression but also without apology. She was also funny. This had surprised him the most on that first night of supper at the Evanses, when she had said something dry and perfectly observed about Thomas's ongoing war with the chipmunk that had been raiding his storeroom for 2 winters running. And Elias had laughed before he could stop himself, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded, and she had looked at him with pure delight, like she had discovered something. She also asked him about his life in a way that was curious without being intrusive, careful of the boundary between interest and interrogation, and he found himself telling her things he did not usually tell people. About Kansas, briefly. about the reason he had come to the mountains, which was that he had needed somewhere that demanded everything of him and left no room for the things he was trying to leave behind. A war that had ended, but not stopped, not really, not for the men who had been in it. He had been 22 when he enlisted, and 24 when Appomattox ended it, and 26 when he had decided that the life waiting for him in eastern Kansas was not the life he wanted to go back to. So he had come west, and then he had come up, and the mountains had taken what he gave them and given him back something he had not had a name for until recently. Clara listened to all of this without pressing and without flinching, and she said, "My father served too. He was at Shiloh." She paused. "He came back different. He never really said how." "No," Elias agreed. "You do not really say how." They sat with that for a moment in the way that two people sit with things that are too large and too old to be fully addressed but need to be acknowledged, and then Thomas came in from the back and asked who wanted more coffee, and the moment passed, but it did not disappear. It was in February, on his 4th or 5th visit to Cutter's Creek, that the trouble started. There was a man named Dodge Hanley, who considered himself the most significant person in the Cutter's Creek Valley, which was a belief not widely shared, but not widely challenged either, because Dodge Hanley was the kind of man who made challenge uncomfortable. He had arrived in the valley 3 years ago with money whose origins were not clear and had since acquired the largest cattle operation in the area, a significant piece of the valley bottomland that most people agreed he had obtained through means that were more pressure than purchase, and a general air of ownership that extended to things he did not technically own. Clara Whitmore, apparently, was among the things he had decided he would like to own. Elias was aware of this because Thomas Evans told him, with the bluntness of a man who believed Elias should know, that Dodge Hanley had been calling on Clara twice a week since she arrived in Cutter's Creek, and that Clara had been politely discouraging him, and that Dodge Hanley did not discourage easily. "He is not a good man," Thomas said plainly, in the direct way of someone who had been watching a situation develop and had formed a firm view of it. "He is a man with money and not much else. Clara is polite to him because she is polite to everyone, but she is not interested, and he does not seem to be accepting that." Elias received this information and sat with it and said nothing in particular, because there was nothing particular he had the standing to say. He was not courting Clara Whitmore. He had supper at her aunt and uncle's table every 3 weeks, and they talked, and that was the full extent of it. He told himself this firmly on the ride back up the mountain and felt the falseness of it the whole way. The confrontation, when it came, was not dramatic in the way of frontier stories. No gunshots, no flying fists. It was more uncomfortable than that, and in some ways more revealing. He came into Cutter's Creek on a Thursday in early March, unexpected because a warm spell had opened the lower trail ahead of his usual schedule, and he found Clara at the general store counter talking with strained politeness to a man who was clearly Dodge Hanley, tall, too well dressed for the mountains, with the kind of handsome face that had probably worked very well for him in his youth, and now served mostly to make his expressions of displeasure look more petulant. He was perhaps 35, with a dark hat and dark eyes, and the slight carelessness in his dress that spoke of money as an afterthought rather than an effort. He was leaning on the counter in the specific way of a man who was taking up space deliberately, and Clara was standing with her weight shifted back and her shoulders very straight, answering his questions about the school with a level of detail that was clearly designed to make the conversation as boring as possible. Thomas Evans was at the back of the store doing something loudly with boxes, in the way of a man who was present without being present. Elias came through the door, and Clara looked up, and something in her face changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that was obvious, but he saw it because he had been watching her face for 2 months with more attention than he had given most things in his life. The tightness around her eyes eased by a fraction. Dodge Hanley turned and assessed him with the quick calculation of a man who was accustomed to assessing potential competition, and clearly found him not particularly worrying. "Kane," he said, with the nod of a man who knew everyone in a 50-mile radius by name and used this knowledge as a form of power. "Hanley," Elias said. He went to the counter and set his order list in front of Thomas, who had materialized from the back with a timing that suggested he had been waiting for reinforcement. He did not look at Clara, and he did not look at Hanley again, because he did not want to make anything out of this that it did not need to be. But Hanley made it something. "I was just telling Miss Whitmore," Hanley said in a conversational tone that was not quite conversation, "that she ought to come out and see the ranch, get a sense of the real scale of the valley. A woman in her position, new to the area, ought to know what there is to know." "I told Mr. Hanley that I appreciate the invitation," Clara said, and her voice was steady and clear, "but that my weeks are very full with the school." "The school closes at 4, Hanley said. "And by 5 I am reviewing lessons for the next day," Clara said. "And by 6 I am helping my aunt with supper, and at 7 I am in bed because I am at the school by 7:30 in the morning." "All that work for 20 a month," Hanley said, and his tone had shifted just slightly into something that was not quite condescending but aimed to get there. Elias put down the rope he had picked up to examine and turned and looked at Hanley directly for the first time. "I believe Miss Whitmore has answered your question," he said, quietly, not threatening, simply clear. Hanley looked at him and recalculated more carefully this time, taking in the full breadth of Elias's shoulders and the particular quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of a man who was not still because he was calm, but because he was controlled, and the difference was apparent if you knew how to look. "Just being friendly," Hanley said after a moment. "I know you are," Elias said. "Good afternoon." Hanley held his gaze for 3 seconds and then picked up his hat and was pleasant to Thomas and nodded to Clara with the careful courtesy of a man who was choosing to be gracious as a strategy rather than as a habit. And he left. The door swung shut and the three of them stood in the sudden quiet, and Thomas said, "Well, I will go get your salt," and disappeared with significant purpose. Clara looked at Elias. "Thank you," she said. "He's been very persistent." "I noticed," he said. "I can handle him," she said, and her chin was up in the way it went up when she was declaring something she was not entirely sure of, but intended to be sure of through the force of saying it. "I know you can," Elias said, "but you should not have to." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "No, I should not." He stayed for supper that night, and he and Clara sat on the front steps of the store, after, in the cold blue March evening, with the stars coming out above the mountains, wrapped in their coats, and they talked about the things that people talk about when they are circling something they are not quite ready to name. About her students. There were 11 of them, ranging from 6 to 14, and she described each one with a vividness and affection that made it obvious she was already fiercely committed to them. About his plans for the spring trapping season, which would take him higher into the mountains. About the books they had both read and the books they had not, and whether Thoreau had actually known what solitude was or whether he had simply romanticized it from a comfortable distance. He had his mother do his laundry, Clara said, with the decisiveness of someone who had formed an opinion on this matter long ago. He walked to Concord for dinner twice a week. It was not exactly wilderness survival. Elias laughed. "No," he said, "it was not." "I think you have lived more of Walden than he ever did," she said, without making nearly as much noise about it. He looked at her sideways, in the dark, and she was looking up at the stars with a small smile, and the stars above the Rockies in March were extraordinary, the kind of stars that existed nowhere near cities or smoke or the perpetual haze of civilization, and he thought that this exact moment, this cold, clear air, and this woman and these mountains, was the kind of thing you could not have prepared for or predicted or protected against, and that the preparation and the prediction and the protection were, in any case, no longer the point. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. He was not a man who spoke easily about internal things. He had been trained by 6 years of solitude and by an entire childhood in a household where feeling was not a language anyone was comfortable in, and he was aware that what he wanted to say required a kind of plain speaking that did not come naturally to him. But he had come to believe in the mountains that the most important things were worth the discomfort of saying directly. "I want to call on you," he said, "properly, if you are willing." She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he began to wonder if he had miscalculated the whole thing, miscalculated the warmth of her attention and the way she laughed and the look on her face when he came through the door of the general store. Then she said, "I've been wondering when you were going to ask." He looked at her. "You've been wondering," he said. "For approximately 6 weeks," she said, and there was laughter in her voice, but also something else, something warmer and more serious. "A woman notices, Mr. Kane." "Elias," he said. "Elias," she said, and the way she said his name in the dark with the stars above the mountains and the creek running under its ice 30 yards away was a thing he was not going to forget. He called on her the following Sunday, which was the 3rd Sunday of the month and therefore church Sunday, and he sat in the pew beside Clara and Marjorie and Thomas Evans, and he had not been inside a church in 3 years, and felt the particular awareness of a man who had been living outside of community, and was now, tentatively and somewhat overwhelmingly, inside it. Clara found this very funny, which she demonstrated only by the slight trembling of her shoulders during the hymn and a sideways look that was pure mischief. He walked with her after church down the main street of Cutter's Creek, and they stopped at the window of the millinery to look at nothing in particular, and kept walking. And a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who was the unofficial record keeper of everything that happened in the valley, watched them from her porch with the focused attention of a woman whose hobby was the social dynamics of her community. And he was aware of this, and did not particularly care. He cared more about the fact that Clara's hand, in the crook of his arm, was warm even through the wool of his coat, and that she smelled like wood smoke and lavender, and that she was telling him about a student named Henry who was 9 years old and could not read, and whom everyone had apparently decided could not read and would never learn. And her voice when she talked about Henry was the voice of a woman who had already decided that everyone else was wrong and had set about proving it. "He is smart," she said fiercely. "He is very smart. He simply sees the letters differently. I have been working with him separately in the last half hour of school, and last week he read an entire sentence, a whole sentence all by himself, and he looked up at me with such a face." She stopped. Her voice had gone a little unsteady. "What did the sentence say?" Elias asked. She laughed a little. "It said, 'The dog ran fast.'" She paused. "It was the most beautiful sentence I have ever heard in my life." He looked down at her as they walked, and thought that he was already past the point of no return, and had been for some time, and that this was fine, that this was in fact the best thing that had happened to him in a longer time than he had words for. March moved into April, and April into May, and the mountains began to do the slow, magnificent thing they did every year, shaking off the snow layer by layer, revealing the dark soil, and then the brown grass, and then, impossibly, the green. Elias made his spring trapping runs and came back to Cutter's Creek more often than was strictly necessary for supply runs, and Clara walked with him in the evenings along the creek bank when the weather allowed, and they talked and sometimes did not talk, and Thomas Evans began to look between them at supper with the satisfied expression of a man who had seen this coming from a considerable distance. On a Friday evening in late May, they were sitting on the low bank of Cutter's Creek, where it ran clear and fast through the meadow south of town, and the willows along the bank were just coming green, and a red-tailed hawk was making circles in the warm air above the valley, and Clara was trailing her fingers in the cold water and talking about a letter she had received from a woman she had been at school with in Pueblo, who had married a banker and moved to Denver and found Denver either wonderful or terrible. The letter was somewhat ambiguous. "She says it is very modern," Clara said, "that there are streetcars." "Do you miss it?" he asked. "That kind of thing?" She thought about it honestly, which was how she thought about everything. "I miss the library," she said. "I miss a good bookshop. I do not miss the noise or the smoke or the feeling that I was always supposed to be somewhere else, doing something more." "What did you feel you were supposed to be doing?" She pulled her fingers from the water and dried them on her skirt and looked at him, and her green eyes were very direct in the late afternoon light, the way they always were when she was deciding to say something she had been thinking for a while. "Marrying well," she said. "That was the chief occupation of women in the circles my father moved in, even the ones who were educated. The education was meant to make you a more charming wife, not a more capable person." She paused. He did not intend it that way. He was genuinely progressive in his thinking, but the world around it was what it was. Elias looked at the hawk circling. "And coming here," he said, "coming to teach. Does it feel like what you wanted? Yes, she said without hesitation. Then, more carefully, this spring has felt like what I wanted, more than I knew how to want. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the hawk made one more circuit above them, and then dropped toward the mountains in a long, gliding arc, and Elias Kane reached over and took Clara Whitmore's hand where it lay on the grass between them. Her fingers closed around his. They sat like that for a while with the creek running beside them and the mountains going gold in the late sun, and it was not the dramatic recognition of some sudden thing, but the quiet acknowledgement of something that had been true for a long time, and there was no need to say anything more about it just then because they already knew. Dodge Hanley's response to all of this was predictable, and in the end, not particularly dangerous, though it was unpleasant enough while it lasted. He made his displeasure known through the mechanisms available to a man of his position, a slight cooling of his business with the Evans General Store, which was felt, but which Thomas Evans absorbed with the steadiness of a man who had been in trade long enough to know that difficult customers came and went, and a campaign of low-level social pressure in which he suggested to various people in the valley that a mountain trapper was not an appropriate prospect for a schoolteacher, and that the school board might want to consider whether Miss Whitmore's personal associations reflected well on her professional position. The school board, which consisted of Thomas Evans, a cattle rancher named Hollis, who liked Clara and did not like Hanley, and a woman named Mrs. Deering, who had 3 children in Clara's school and had watched Henry learn to read and was thoroughly on Clara's side, discussed this suggestion and concluded that it was not their business who the schoolteacher walked with by the creek on Friday evenings, and that was the end of it officially. Unofficially, Elias went to see Hanley. He did this not because he was worried about Hanley as a physical threat, which he was not, but because he believed in plain speaking and thought the situation warranted it. He rode out to Hanley's ranch on a Tuesday morning and found Hanley in the yard supervising the branding, and walked up to him directly and said, without any particular hostility but with considerable clarity, that if Hanley continued his campaign of social interference with Miss Whitmore's professional life, Elias would consider it a personal matter and would address it as such. Hanley looked at him for a long time, at the width of those shoulders, at the particular quality of calm in Elias's dark eyes, and then he said that he had nothing against Miss Whitmore and that he hoped she was very happy. "Thank you," Elias said. "I believe she will be." And he rode back to town. He told Clara about this visit because he believed she had the right to know about things that concerned her, and she was quiet for a moment after he told her, and then she said, "You did not ask me before you went." "No," he said. "I should have." She looked at him with the steady green gaze that he was learning to read in its various registers. This was the look that meant she was deciding what she thought and intended to say it accurately. "I can handle my own professional matters," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know that," he said. "I did not go because I did not think you could handle it. I went because I wanted him to know that you were not alone, and I should have asked you first." Another pause, shorter this time. "All right," she said. "Yes, you should have. But I understand why you did it." "Are you angry?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly, "and a little grateful. It is a complicated feeling." "Yes," he said. "I expect it is." She looked at him for another moment, and then she said, "Do not do it again without asking." "I will not," he said, and he meant it, and she knew he meant it, and that was the end of that. June came in warm and golden, and the mountains above Cutter's Creek were in their brief and absolute summer glory. The meadows above the timberline bright with wildflowers, the elk calving in the high parks, the creeks running full and wild with snowmelt that foamed white over the rocks. Elias took Clara up the mountain one Sunday, on horses, to show her the high meadow above his cabin, where the land opened up into a great bowl of grass and sky that was, as far as he was concerned, the finest view in the Colorado Territory and possibly in the entire world. She sat her horse at the edge of the meadow and looked out across the bowl at the peaks marching away in every direction and at the valley far below, where the tiny glint of Cutter's Creek was just barely visible. And she did not say anything for a long time, and he waited. And then she said very softly, "Oh, Elias." "Yes," he said. "This is what it is," she said. "This is what it actually is, All of it. He was not entirely sure what she meant, but he understood it, which was the same thing. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in July, sitting on the steps of the Evans General Store in the evening with the light going long and amber over the valley and the mountains rising behind it all like a painted backdrop too magnificent to be believed. He did it without preamble or performance, in the plain-speaking way that was his way, and he looked at her directly while he said it and watched her face. She said yes before he had quite finished asking. He had not thought she would say no. He had believed, based on the evidence available to him, that the answer would be yes. But hearing it still moved him in a way that he had not anticipated, a sudden warm pressure in the chest that was entirely new and entirely welcome. He had a ring, a small gold band that he had bought from the jeweler in the next town over on his last supply run, calculating the odds about as carefully as he had ever calculated anything. And when he put it on her finger, she held her hand up and looked at it in the evening light, and then she looked at him and she was smiling. The full, unguarded smile that he had come to understand was rarer and more valuable than the composed, pleasant one she offered the general world. "I love you," she said. It was the first time either of them had said it directly, and she said it with a clarity and directness that was entirely characteristic. "I love you," he said back, and the plainness of it, the absolute undisguised plainness of it, was exactly right. They were married in September, in the church in Cutter's Creek on a Thursday, not a preacher's Sunday, but the preacher had come through on his circuit and they had asked him to stay, and he had agreed because Thomas Evans had pressed a particularly nice roast chicken upon him, and the man was not made of stone. The whole of Cutter's Creek came, because the whole of Cutter's Creek came to everything, and Henry sat in the front pew between his mother and his father, and could now read at a second-grade level, which Clara had told Elias about that morning with her eyes bright and fierce, and old Mrs. Aldrich wept in the way of women who have been watching events develop with considerable personal investment. Clara wore a deep green wool dress that Marjorie Evans had helped her make, which was the finest thing Elias had ever seen on any person in any place, and she stood beside him at the front of the church with the sun coming through the window, making everything gold. And she looked up at him when the preacher began to speak with an expression that was love and humor and certainty all at once, and he thought that 6 years of loneliness in the mountains was an extraordinarily reasonable price for this exact moment. He had built them a cabin, not his old cabin, or not only his old cabin. He had spent July and August building an addition onto the original structure, 2 new rooms of good squared timber that he had cut himself and hauled down from the high forest, and notched and fitted with the meticulous care of a man who was building something meant to stand for a long time. He had put in a proper floor, pine boards planed smooth, and a second window with real glass panes that he had ordered from the supply house in Denver and carried up the mountain himself, which had been an adventure involving Luther, a very narrow section of trail, and a great deal of slow and careful maneuvering. He had built a proper bed frame of cedar, big enough to accommodate a man his size, with a mattress of mountain grass and wool that Marjorie Evans had helped stuff and sew. He had cut a shelf above the bed for books and stocked it with the Shakespeare and the Thoreau and the Dickens, and a new copy of Jane Eyre that he had ordered alongside the glass panes and that he had given to Clara at supper the night before the wedding with the straightforwardness of a man who had read it and thought she would like it very much. And Clara had held the book in both hands and looked at him with the full unguarded smile and said that he was the most unexpectedly literary mountain man in the entire territory. "I had a lot of winters," he said. On the night of their wedding, after the supper at the Evans house that had grown to include half the town and lasted until the candles were burning low and the children were asleep on their mothers' laps, after the last good night had been said and the last embrace exchanged and the horses saddled and the long mountain trail climbed in the warm September dark, after all of it, they arrived at the cabin in the last of the moonlight, and Elias lifted Clara down from her horse with his hands around her waist and set her on the ground before the door. She looked up at him in the moonlight, this woman who had come screaming off a ridge road in January with snow in her hair and fury in her eyes, and had proceeded to entirely change the shape of his world, and she said, "Carry me over the threshold?" He had heard of this custom. He had not given it any particular thought. He looked at her, and then he reached down and lifted her, not in the careful sideways fashion of a man performing a symbolic gesture, but with the easy completeness of a man who could carry 100-pound bear 6 miles through mountain snow without breaking his stride. And she was considerably lighter than a 100-pound bear, and considerably more precious. And she laughed when he did it, the real laugh, the surprised and genuine one. And she put her arms around his neck as he carried her through the doorway into the warmth of the cabin, where the banked fire threw soft red light and the cedar smell of new wood mixed with the pine and the mountain dark outside. He set her down gently in the center of the new floor, and she stood in the firelight in her green dress with her hair coming loose from its pins as it always did. And he looked at her for a moment with the particular feeling of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was traveling to, and finds that it is more than he imagined. "It is beautiful," she said softly, looking around the cabin, taking in the new rooms and the smooth floor and the glass window and the cedar bed with the books above it. "Elias, you built all of this." "For you," he said simply. She turned and looked at him with the green eyes that he'd been reading for months now, and that still sometimes said things he did not entirely have words for, and she crossed the cabin to him and put her hands flat on his chest against the worn flannel of his shirt, and looked up at him with everything in her face that she had ever been careful about in public, and nothing held back at all. "I know," she said. "I know you did." He brought her face up to his and kissed her, this woman, his wife, with all the tenderness that 6 years of mountain solitude and 1 Colorado winter and 100 conversations by firelight and on creek banks had accumulated in him, and outside the mountains stood patient and enormous in the dark, and the creek ran somewhere below them, and the stars came out one by one above the high peaks. And none of it was anything he could have expected or planned for, and all of it was exactly right. In the weeks that followed, the cabin became something that had never quite existed in Elias's life before, which was a home rather than a shelter. Clara brought her books and arranged them on the shelf above the bed. She found a way to make the rough-hewn table level using a piece of smooth stone wedged under one corner and declared this an excellent solution. She grew herbs in a clay pot on the windowsill, and they died, and she grew them again, more successfully the second time, and she filled the single small vase he owned with late-season wildflowers until the frost killed them. She went down to the school every weekday morning, riding Luther when the weather was good and going by foot with Elias when it was not, because he made the walk with her every morning and came back to the cabin and worked through the day and met her at the edge of town in the evening unless the weather turned or a more pressing task intervened. And even then, she knew the trail well enough by October to make the 6 miles on her own, which she did with perfect competence, and which he worried about anyway, because he was a man for whom the protection of something he loved was not a reasoned decision, but a bone-deep instinct. He told her this once, that he worried about her on the trail alone, not because he did not trust her competence, but because he knew the mountain and knew its moods and what happened to even the most capable person when it turned. She had looked at him with the steady green gaze and said, "You're going to have to learn to let the worry sit. I'm not going to stop living to spare you the anxiety." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" He thought about it. "Nothing," he said. "I'm telling you I worry, not asking you to change anything. I thought you should know." She had looked at him for a moment, and then she had said quietly, "Thank you for the difference." Autumn turned the valley gold and then brown, and the aspens on the mountain slopes went their extraordinary yellow that lasted 2 weeks and then was gone, and the first snow came in October, and Elias went into his mountain winter routines with Clara beside him. Or rather, he adapted his mountain winter routines to include Clara, which was a different thing entirely and a better one. She learned quickly. She learned to read the sky and what it meant. She learned where the deadfall was for firewood and how to split it, though he did most of the splitting because he found it satisfying, and she found it useful to let him find it satisfying. She learned to bank the fire correctly for a long night, and which of the stores needed rotating, and how to read the thermometer he had made himself from a strip of copper and calibrate it against the seasons. In exchange, she did things for the cabin and for him that he had not known he was missing. She was a far better cook than he was, not dramatically better, since the ingredients available at high altitude in a Colorado winter were finite, but inventively better, coaxing things from beans and cornmeal and dried meat that he would not have imagined possible. She read aloud in the evenings, which was a habit she had, and which he had not encountered before, and the first time she did it, sitting by the fire with the Shakespeare open and reading the middle of Twelfth Night in a clear, unself-conscious voice with the wind howling outside. He had sat very still and listened and felt something in him go absolutely quiet. "You should say when you want me to stop," she said after a while. "Do not stop," he said. She did not stop. They went through the Shakespeare that winter, play by play, in the evenings, and debated the plays afterward with the same vigor she brought to everything, and it was the best winter of his life by a considerable distance. She was pregnant by November, a fact she arrived at gradually, and reported to him on a cold Tuesday afternoon in the cabin with a matter-of-factness that was belied by the brightness of her eyes. He sat very still for a moment, and then he crossed the cabin in 3 strides and pulled her against his chest carefully, not his usual bear hug of a hold, but something more careful and more wondering. And she laughed into his shoulder and said, "I am not fragile." "I know you are not," he said into her hair. "I am." She laughed harder at that and leaned back to look at his face, and what she saw there made her stop laughing and simply look at him, and she put her hand against his jaw and said softly, "We are going to be very good at this." "Yes," he said without any doubt at all. "We are." He brought her down to Cutter's Creek more often through the winter months, careful about the weather and the trail conditions, and Marjorie Evans clucked and fussed over her in the best possible way, and Thomas Evans made up reasons to bring out extra food whenever they visited, and seemed personally delighted by the whole situation. The town received the news with the warm, communal pleasure of a small place that had invested itself in the outcome, and Mrs. Aldrich told everyone who would listen that she had seen it coming from the moment Elias Kane had walked into the church that first Sunday with a look on his face like a man who had just figured something out. The winter passed in the way that good winters pass, not quickly, because there was too much to fill them, but warmly, with the particular richness of a life being built between 2 people who were well-suited and fully present to each other. There were hard days, because the mountain in winter allowed for hard days regularly, storms that kept them cabin-bound for 4 or 5 days at a stretch, mornings when the cold was so extreme that even with the fire going full, the water in the wash basin froze before they could use it. But hard days with another person were different from hard days alone, and Elias found that he was discovering this difference repeatedly, like a man relearning a language he had once known. There were disagreements, because 2 people of strong will and genuine character living in close quarters will have disagreements and should, and they were learning how to have them cleanly, with full words and direct statements, and the understanding that the disagreement was about the specific thing and not about the larger shape of what they had, which was not in question. He was sometimes too silent, and she was sometimes too relentless, and he had to learn to say what was troubling him before it became a wall. And she had to learn that his silences were not distance, and all of this was the ordinary and necessary work of becoming known to another person, and it was, even in its difficulty, something he was grateful for. Their son was born on a Tuesday in August of 1874 in the cabin on the mountain, with a midwife from Cutter's Creek who came up the trail with Thomas Evans driving the wagon and Marjorie Evans in the back, and the whole thing was faster and more triumphant and more terrifying than Elias had been fully prepared for, which was how he understood that nothing fully prepares a person for this particular experience. He was in the cabin the whole time. He held Clara's hand when she needed it held, and stayed out of the way when the midwife needed room, and was entirely useless in all the ways that a man in that situation is entirely useless, and knew it and stayed anyway, because she had said she wanted him there, and that was all the reason required. When the midwife put the baby in Clara's arms and the baby made the sound that it made, the first sound, the one that announces everything, Clara looked up at Elias with her hair dark with sweat and her face spent and brilliant, and she said, "Come here." He came, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and she turned the baby so he could see its face, and he looked at his son for the first time with the full force of everything he was, the mountain man and the soldier and the solitary and the husband and all of it. And he found that he was not for the first time since Clara Whitmore had appeared, screaming off a ridge road in the snow, entirely undone. "Hello," Clara said softly to the baby, as if they were being introduced at a perfectly ordinary occasion, and Elias laughed, a helpless and overwhelmed and entirely happy sound, and Clara looked up at him and laughed too. They named him James, after Clara's father, and he was from the beginning a child of particular character, large like his father, from almost the moment of his birth, with his mother's green eyes and dark auburn hair, and a disposition toward absolute opinions expressed with great force, which he had from both of them, and in double measure. He was a baby who approached the world as though it had been put there specifically for him to investigate, and a toddler who could not be discouraged from any course of action by any means short of physical removal. And Elias carried him everywhere in the first year in the crook of one arm, and the relief and the joy of it, the specific irreplaceable weight of his son against his chest, was something he did not have adequate words for in any language. Clara went back to the school in October, when James was 2 months old, and Marjorie Evans offered, with considerable enthusiasm, to watch the baby during school hours. This was a solution that worked magnificently. James spent his days with his great aunt, who adored him unconditionally and let him do things his parents would not have allowed, and Clara went back to her 11 students, now 13, including a Henry, who was reading at a 4th grade level and had recently begun helping the younger children with their letters, which Clara described to Elias over supper with a pride that was the exact same fierce warmth she brought to everything she cared about. The school grew. By the following year, there were 16 students, and the school board agreed that they needed a proper school building to replace the cramped one-room frame structure, and a fundraising drive produced enough money for a second room and a proper outbuilding. And Elias spent 3 weekends in the autumn of 1875 as part of the building crew, swinging a hammer alongside Thomas Evans and Hollis the rancher and 4 other men from the valley. And Clara came to watch one afternoon and sat on a fence post with James on her lap and watched him work, and he could feel her watching and did not mind at all. Dodge Hanley had left the valley in the spring of 1874, taking his cattle and his money and his displeasure to somewhere south, and the land he had held was parceled out over the following year to smaller ranchers in ways that Thomas Evans said were considerably more fair, and the general disposition of Cutter's Creek improved without him in it, which said something about the difference one person's character can make to the atmosphere of a place. The winter of 1875 was a hard one, harder than the previous 2, with storms coming in faster and colder and the pass closing earlier than usual, and Elias took Clara down to Cutter's Creek in late October and kept her there through November and December when the trail was at its worst, going up himself to check the cabin and the stores and coming down every 10 days or so, and they both found this arrangement unsatisfactory in the specific way of 2 people who had become accustomed to each other's daily presence. "Next winter," he told her in December, standing in the Evans kitchen with snow on his coat and James pulling at his boot, "I'm going to build a proper road, something a wagon can use." "You're going to build a road," she repeated. "A better trail then, something that holds in the deep snow." She looked at him with the measuring look. "That would take years," she said. "Then I will start in the spring," he said. He did start in the spring, and it did take years. 2 full summers of work, with help from a rancher named Cal Foote, who lived on the lower mountain and had similar ideas about trail improvement. And by the autumn of 1877, the trail between the cabin and Cutter's Creek was a proper track, wide enough for a light wagon and graded to hold its shape through most of the winter, which meant that the cabin on the mountain became a year-round home in a way it had not been before, which was what Elias had intended from the moment he began planning it. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1877 in the newly expanded cabin with the same midwife and the same attendant cast of Marjorie and Thomas Evans, and she was small and fierce and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's disposition for forming immediate and absolute opinions, and they named her Margaret after Marjorie Evans, who received this news by sitting down suddenly in the nearest chair and saying nothing for a full minute, which was the only time Elias had ever seen Marjorie Evans lost for words. James, who was 3, regarded the baby with the focused scrutiny of a scientist examining an unknown specimen. He poked her finger carefully with one of his own and reported to his father that she was very small. Elias agreed that Yes, she was very small. James said she would probably get bigger. Elias said she certainly would. James seemed to find this satisfactory and went back to his blocks. Clara watched this exchange over the baby's head with the full, unguarded smile and said, "He is going to be a wonderful older brother." "Yes," Elias agreed, "he's going to be insufferable about it." "Yes," she agreed, "both." The years settled into themselves with the particular comfortable richness of a life that had found its shape. Elias continued his trapping and expanded into some timber work as the valley grew and the demand for good lumber with it, and he was known across 3 counties as the man to call when you needed something heavy moved or something impossible built, and he was fair in his dealings and reliable in his commitments, and the kind of man people described as someone they were glad was there when things went wrong. He had a reputation for silence and competence, and for the occasional dry observation that came out of nowhere and was funnier than anything a more obviously funny person would have managed, and for the absolute unshakable way he looked after his family and his land. Clara taught for 12 years at Cutter's Creek, watching her students grow up and grow out of the valley and go to cities and come back, watching the school grow from 11 students in a cramped frame building to 28 in a proper 2-room schoolhouse with a library shelf that she had built up over the years through donations and purchases, and the occasional mild campaign of persistent suggestion. Henry, her first difficult reader, became a carpenter and built a house in Cutter's Creek, and when his first child reached school age, he brought her to Clara and said she was a smart one, and he wanted her to have a good start, and Clara had taken the little girl's hand and said she could already tell that was true. James grew the way his father had grown, large and early, and with a quality of solid capability that showed up in everything he did, and by the time he was 12, he was doing half the work of a grown man on the mountain property, not because Elias required it, but because he wanted to and could not be talked out of it. He had his mother's fierceness of opinion and his father's patience, and he was an easy child in the way of children who know clearly who they are, and Elias watched him and thought regularly about the extraordinary contingency of things, how a broken axle and a woman's scream in the January snow had produced, among other things, this boy. Margaret was different, not smaller or quieter, but inward in a way that James was not, keeping her own counsel until she had something to say, and then saying it with the precision of someone who had been thinking about it for some time. She loved books with the total love of a reader, and she could often be found on winter afternoons behind the cabin in what had become the reading corner, a bench Elias had built against the south wall that caught the afternoon sun and was sheltered from the wind, with a book and a blanket and no interest in being disturbed. She was her mother's daughter in this, and in the fierce green eyes that neither of them could maintain seriousness in when something struck them as funny, and she was her father's daughter in the way she moved through the mountain with ease, and in the way she could read the weather better than most adults by the time she was 10. There were ordinary days and hard days and days of extraordinary beauty and days of tedious difficulty, and all of it was life, which was to say, it was everything Elias had been trying to find when he had first climbed into these mountains as a 26-year-old with nothing but a pack and a rifle and a vague, desperate need for something real. He had found the mountains, and then, improbably and entirely, he had found Clara. He found her every morning when he woke, and she was already moving quietly through the cabin, getting the fire going before the cold reached the children's bunks, or standing at the window in the gray pre-dawn light with her hands around a cup, looking out at the mountain in that particular concentrated stillness that meant she was thinking through the day ahead. He found her in the evenings when she came in from the trail with the school day in her eyes, and sat down and took off her boots, and he handed her a cup, and she told him about Henry's daughter, who was learning to read faster than anyone she had ever taught, or about the argument she had had with the school board about ordering new books, which she had won, because she always won eventually. He found her in the middle of the night sometimes when the mountain was so quiet that the silence had weight, and she was asleep beside him with her hair dark against the pillow and her breathing even and slow, and he lay there and felt the extraordinary specific gravity of what he had, which was not what he would have chosen or planned or imagined, but was exactly, precisely, wholly what he wanted. One evening in October of 1880, when James was 6 and Margaret was 3 and Elias was 38 and Clara was 30. They sat on the cabin steps in the last of a warm autumn evening, with the mountains going purple in the dusk and the valley below just beginning to show its lights. And Clara was leaning against him, with her head on his shoulder, in the comfortable way of two people who had been touching each other for years and had found the geography of each other by heart. James was inside with a book, and Margaret was asleep on the bear rug, the hide of the bear he had shot on the day he had heard Clara's scream, which he had finally tanned and brought down from the mountain cabin when they had moved in for winter the first year, and which had become, through some process of family mythology that he had not entirely followed, the official reading rug and napping surface for anyone under 4 feet tall. "Do you remember?" Clara said in the low voice of someone half asleep. "The first night, in the cabin." "The berry water," he said. She laughed softly against his shoulder. "The berry water," she agreed, "and the Shakespeare on the shelf. I thought, whoever this man is, he is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She considered. "Rougher," she said, "in every sense. Simpler. Someone who was only the mountains and nothing else." "The mountains were enough for a long time," he said. "I know," she said, "but you were ready for more than that. You just didn't know it yet." He put his arm around her more fully, drawing her in against his side, and looked out at the mountains in the fading light. She was right, which she frequently was, and he had learned to say so rather than simply accepting it in silence, which was one of the things she had taught him over 7 years of marriage. That agreement was worth saying, the same way the other things were. "You are right," he said. "I know I am," she said, and he could hear the smile in it. "I almost always am." "You're right about almost everything," he said. "You were wrong about the new chicken coop." She sat up and looked at him. "I was not wrong about the new chicken coop. The placement was wrong," he said, straight-faced. "The wind comes from the north-northeast in February, and—" "Do not make me argue with you on a beautiful evening about a chicken coop," she said. He was grinning. She could tell, even in the dusk. She poked him in the ribs with one finger, which was a habit she had developed in the first year of their marriage and had apparently decided was a permanent fixture in her repertoire. "You are impossible," she said. "You love me," he said. She leaned back against his shoulder and looked at the mountains. "Absolutely, without question," she said. "It is one of the more unreasonable things I have ever done." "Arguably," he said, "the most reasonable." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, you are right about that." The mountains were going dark now, shape without color, and the first stars were appearing above the peaks, the ones that always appeared first above that particular ridge to the east, the ridge where he had heard a woman scream in the snow and had looked at a dead bear and made a decision. He thought about that moment sometimes, in the way you think about the moments that hinge on nothing. A quarter-mile of distance, a wrong fork in a mountain road, a wheel dropping into a hidden ditch. The pure contingency of it. The terrifying, wonderful arbitrariness of how things assembled themselves into lives. He had been a man alone on a mountain, and then he had not been. And the difference was everything. And it had started with a scream in the snow, and a bear hanging in a spruce tree, and a woman picking herself up out of a snowbank with ice in her hair and fury in her green eyes, who had asked him his name and considered him carefully, and then accepted his help and given him hers in return, and had never stopped. Inside the cabin, he could hear James put his book down and say something to the fire, one of the private running observations he kept up when he thought no one was listening. Outside, the creek was running in the dark below them, still unfrozen in the warm October, its sound carrying up to the cabin steps through the still mountain air. The stars came out fully above the eastern ridge, the same stars that had been there the night they were married, the same stars that would be there long after everything else, and they sat together in the way of two people who had arrived somewhere whole. Elias put his face against Clara's hair and breathed in the wood smoke and lavender of her, and she turned her face up to him in the dark and kissed him with the warmth of 7 years of mornings and evenings and all the days between. And it was not different from the first kiss, except that it was richer, deepened by everything that had come after it, the way a river is the same river at its mouth as it was at its source, but is also by then something larger. "Come inside," she said quietly against his lips. He stood and pulled her up with him, his hands around her waist in the dark the way his hands had always known the geography of her, and he carried her through the doorway, not the ceremonial carrying of a wedding night, but the easy, habitual carrying of a man who carried things, who had always carried things, who had once carried a 100-pound bear 6 miles through mountain snow and then run a ridge to help a stranger, and for whom lifting the woman he loved was the most natural thing in the world. She laughed as he did it, the real laugh, the genuine surprised delight of it even after all this time. And she held on to him as he ducked through the doorway and set her down inside, where the fire was burning warm, and James was reading on the floor, and Margaret was asleep on the bear rug with her small fist curled under her chin. And the cabin held them all of its people, all of its light, all of its accumulated ordinary and extraordinary days. The way good houses hold everything that has ever happened in them, warm and solid against the dark. He would build a 3rd room in the spring, because there was a 3rd child coming. Clara had told him just that morning in the matter-of-fact way she had, with the brightness in her eyes that was never quite entirely matter-of-fact. And he had done what he always did, and gone very still for a moment, and then pulled her in against his chest and held on, and she had laughed into his shirt and said he was going to have to start building sooner or later. He would build it from good mountain timber, cut in March when the sap was still low, and he would build it to last, and he would do it the way he did everything, with his hands and his back, and all the considerable strength of a man who had been given, entirely unexpectedly and against all his own best preparations for a life alone, the exact life he was meant for. Outside, the mountains stood in the dark, as they had stood for 10,000 years and would stand for 10,000 more, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small warm light burning in the cabin on the high trace, the 2 children asleep and the 2 adults moving quietly through the room, the sound of low voices and the fire's crack and the creek's distant running voice making up the whole perfect ordinary music of it. Elias Kane, mountain man, trapper, timber worker, father, husband, a man built broad and deep by the mountains he had chosen and the life that had chosen him, checked the fire one last time and looked at his children and turned down the lamp, and in the last ember light he could see Clara watching him from across the room with the full, unguarded love she had given him from the beginning, no pretense and no reservation, and he crossed to her, and she came to him, and the mountains kept their long watch outside, and the story of that life went on.